Mr. Carney has been right there, the architect of failed economic policy. And he is just the same as Mr. Trudeau, but will accelerate us down a road of making us more poor.
As time goes on, Canadians are learning more about Mark Carney, and not in a good way. Sam Cooper, investigative journalist for The Bureau, sat down with us and revealed some disturbing links between Mark Carney and the People's Republic of China. It doesn't matter whether you support the Liberals or not, you are going to want to hear this.
Let's take a look. Sam, welcome back to Northern Perspective. It's great to have you on again.
Great to be back.
So a lot has happened. I think the world has changed since we last spoke. That's what it feels like anyhow. But you've been doing a lot of work around covering Mark Carney, Brookfield, potential other avenues of interference. And for those that don't know, check out Sam's work at The Bureau and subscribe to his articles. Support independent journalism like this, especially that of the caliber of Sam Cooper. But let's just, I'll ask you just a general question, Sam. So Mark Carney is now the quote unquote prime minister, even though he's unelected. There were some concerns that we touched on in our last conversation about Mark Carney, but Give us your take on why Canadians should be a little bit more than concerned with the potential connections that he has.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've done a few stories on Mr. Carney now, sort of doing my due diligence as a journalist to look into this person that very clearly, for any astute political observer, it appeared that, he was getting the torch passed to him. It wasn't much of a race to replace Justin Trudeau. And, for poll watchers, I mean, it's incredible that the Conservatives were very much in the lead. Justin Trudeau was very unpopular. And then it appears that the Liberal Party, in a very savvy way, kicked the can. They engineered a leadership race. And the Justin Trudeau's handlers, top staff, big-time backers, coagulated around Carney, pretty much, ushering him into the prime minister's chair. So, of course, the rule one in journalism is follow the money, and I would add follow the power. So with Mr. Carney, and try to provide transparency. So, there's so much to talk about, but I felt important to look at Mr. Carney, who it now is basically a prime minister elected by a relatively very small number of party faithful. And even that, the Liberal leadership race, we've heard, was clearly in some ways touched by foreign interference, in that Chrystia Freeland, the main challenger, was subject of the very same WeChat, Chinese messaging app, disinformation attacks that Kenny Chu was subject of, as we talked about in our last conversation. So I guess the first thing to say is, you'll have a lot of questions, but Mark Carney, everyone knows, a central banker in two countries, Goldman Sachs alum, a civil servant and plutocrat of the highest order in the world, really. And, so I did a story looking at his links to both the World Economic Foundation, which, as you know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding this body in Davos with, very wealthy people that travel in and come up with ideas and policy. But I found that it was, a reasonable to look at Mr. Carney's connection to that foundation that brings together other wealthy people that have already supported him from outside the country. So without rambling too long, those include one important name, Jin Li-kun. This is the director of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is this is an entity in China that has been exposed allegedly as a vehicle of Chinese Communist Party influence. they're involved in development deals around the world, and they're involved with Mr. Carney through their president Jin Likun, who is a former Red Guard and is a Chinese communist operative, according to a Canadian executive that left that body. The point here is that a senior communist figure involved in green deals with Mark Carney that tie into the World Economic Foundation. And, without connecting too many dots, I found that a number of people from Canada are linked to various, NGOs that circle around Mark Carney, have the same sorts of policies. And in a nutshell, why does that matter? Because all of them are interested in deeply investing with China, being involved in net zero global mandates, and Canadians should know. Mark Carney has supposedly ditched the carbon tax for retail, for the average voter. But I think we'd be a little bit naive to believe that he won't be pushing these international net zero deals if elected. And we're going to have an election very soon.
Well, and he's even come out and said so much in terms of his intent to put in a quote unquote carbon border adjustment or a carbon tax tariff, essentially saying if you deal with us and you don't believe in net zero, we're going to tax you for it. Not a great strategy when you're dealing with the United States that would be subject to that carbon tax tariff. But the other thing that I'd found that was interesting is that when Carney was head of Brookfield between, I believe it was 2021 and 2024, the value of the assets that they had in Canada, they had decreased by about 4%. So they pulled that information, that equity out of Canada, while at the same time, their assets within China increased by, I believe it was something like 32% or 38%. It went up to, I think, 13 to 18 billion dollars. So to me, I don't know if they're correlated, but it feels like they're taking the equity out of Canada and giving it to China over that exact same period of time that he was chair of Brookfield. So in terms of Brookfield, what are you finding that is not being discussed in the mainstream media at this point? Well, not much is being discussed about Brookfield in the mainstream media.
Yeah, no, that's a great data point and data dive you did there about a shift of investment from North America to China, and that will lead to all kinds of outcomes, I believe. But you're right. I did a story a week ago looking at, as you know, I like to focus on real estate and China. I looked at Brookfield's investments, and so before Mr. Carney joined in 2020, they had a very interesting deal for about 750 million, I believe, US dollars, a commercial real estate deal in Shanghai. This is in 2013. So as I know, a foreign investor does not invest inside China unless the party approves and there's an endorsement, and there will be certainly political sensitivity involved in that investment. And so I dug a little deeper. Remember, this is before Mr. Carney's time, but this, let's just call it a $1 billion commercial real estate play in Shanghai, who Brookfield partnered with was a Hong Kong tycoon that I dug deeper. And this tycoon is involved in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is a body that the CIA calls the Central Core United Front entity of the Chinese Communist Party. And as many of my reports have shown, a number of the individuals, a lot of them wealthy business persons from Hong Kong and Macau, they're not just your average, if you can call it, ex-China or Western business person. They're people that will promote the ideals or the objectives of the Communist Party. And many of them have more, let's just say, interesting, sometimes underworld connections. So I don't know if that's the case with this tycoon that Brookfield bought into for this commercial real estate play. But what I do know is it will be meaningful in Beijing for Brookfield to partner with someone in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And I only had to read the China Daily to find this this Hong Kong investor talking about, Hong Kong being important for the motherland because it would be a way to channel business from Western investors. And hey, look, Brookfield is a Western investor. So that's that. But then I went further. And in 2024, Mark Carney, now chair of Brookfield, secured a $300 million loan from the Bank of China. Now, this is very interesting because it's essentially a bridge, or you could call it an emergency loan, because Brookfield in 2017 bought another $2 billion worth of real estate in Shanghai. So they now have $3 billion worth of holdings there, bought at the peak of the market. Of course, that's gone down. And Mr. Carney comes in to save the day with a $300 million Bank of China loan. I'll end here. I mean, interesting to me, at the Bank of England, Mark Carney had made what's called a swap line deal with the Bank of China and, the Bank of England. This means that China and England can borrow each other's money. And Mr. Carney in his speech called it, UK at the heart of globalization. And he said it's a good thing to help the Chinese, renminbi be used around the world. And as I say, that might have sounded good in 2013, but as we're on a collision course between Beijing and Washington, I don't think that sounds good in Washington now. So a lot to dive into on the green side as well, but I found it, you could say that, Beijing, just as it has its hooks into Hong Kong tycoons like Li Ka-shing, Stanley Ho, and others, where they have kind of, symbiotic relationships, you could say they've got their hooks into Mark Carney because he's a privileged Westerner investing in China. In my belief, I think that's a good question.
Well, and I believe in one of your articles, you actually show a picture where Mark Carney's on one side and the president of China, Xi Jinping, is standing on the other. So, this isn't a guy that, has been working through intermediaries. It's not like he's only been on Zoom calls. He's been in the same room as the elite for China. So this relationship this is not conspiracy theory. This is factual.
This is factual, and the point of that meeting in 2024 was, again, China's economy is crashing. Some people think that Xi Jinping isn't quite as strong as he would look from the outside. They need that Western investment. So when they need a handful of, top Western executives, who can they call on? Mark Carney is among, the short list that shows up in Beijing. Furthermore, I found, again, government of China records that showed that Mr. Carney also met with, before securing that Bank of China loan that I talk about in 2024, he met with the mayor of Beijing, and they talked about securing win-wins for China and Western investors. And, some of your listeners will know, if we're talking about Brookfield and BlackRock, both of those executives were in the room, and these are two of the most, influential Western investment funds. And if they're dealing straight with Beijing, again, in my books, there's things going on that should be of interest in those relationships to Canadian voters. But how many Canadian voters, as you and I do, as your team does, will think down the road and say, look, if Mark Carney for years has had this privileged relationship with Beijing, we can expect that will, impact policies when he steps into when he actually steps into the House of Commons. And, I know we're all supposed to be mad at Washington right now, and they're doing some pretty rough things to Canada rhetorically. But if I have to choose between Beijing and Washington, I don't want to make Washington more mad at Canada.
Well, and I think we're seeing, the relationship start to bear fruit for Mark Carney, at least, even in an indirect way. Because as we saw the leadership campaign start to unfold, we saw you had firms like Ecos, where Frank Graves had publicly stated that he was going to do anything possible to make sure Pierre Poilievre didn't win. Yes. And then recently, we did a video on that. He actually came out and said, "Oh well, if I had a nickel every time this tweet came up, I wouldn't need to work anymore." And I'd apologized for that. Didn't actually say that he wasn't going to. He just apologized for it. And now,
right.
and now you had this other mystery polling firm that we noticed start to drop polls. I believe it was about a week ago, called Liaison Strategies, and this was a polling firm that, from our research, we couldn't find any record of them doing a single federal poll for the last 3 to 4 years. All of a sudden, they've done 6 polls in 7 days or something like that, all that are favoring the Liberals. Now, in our work, which viewers that are watching this, you may have seen the video last night, the owner of this is tied to 2 different people that are allegedly connected to foreign interference. And you'd covered one of them back in 2019.
Okay, I've got my pen out here because it sounds like you're going to drop something and I may need to make a note. So please go ahead.
So it was back in 2019 when the Liberal MP for Don Valley North, Gung Tan, was connected to foreign interference. He was also connected to a scandal where he allegedly fathered the child of somebody that was a staffer for him, and then since denied that, was kicked out of the Liberal Party. Lo and behold, was then replaced by Han Dong, who was allegedly selected by the PRC in terms of that Liberal candidate race, and we've seen how that has played out. He's since denied it, but there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. And then after this person, Alexander Danoff, left that agency office since he was out of a job, he then in 2021 spun up some companies, Liaison Strategies, Election Print, and Focus Research, all with competing type of priorities that led to him starting this polling firm. Now, this is bizarre because there hasn't really been a federal poll from this polling firm. Now, at the same time, he then joins the Canada-China Forum, which is also attended by Yuan Pao Wu, which you have told us is connected to foreign interference. So wherever this guy seems to go, he's connected to Chinese foreign interference. And now, right before the election, all of a sudden his polling firm decides to drop all of these polls that are in Mark Carney's favor. So there's some really, really strange things going on right now. And it seems like if I'm looking at this objectively, which I'm trying to, and based on the information that you're covering, it seems like China is kind of cashing in on that. Okay, we need to get Mark Carney elected because he's going to be very pro-China as a prime minister for Canada, and he may look the other way regarding all of the activities that we've had. And his chief of staff, Marco Mendocino's already had a history of looking the other way for China too. So why not Mark Carney?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I'll start with, Mark Carney. Yeah, I do believe, one, I've seen, his travel out to Richmond, early in his campaign, meeting with Liberal MP Parm Baines, who I have said should be in the NSI COP report as a witting or unwitting beneficiary of United Front activity. Video showed a known United Front leader together meeting with Baines and Carney. Chinese media very clearly supportive of Mark Carney. Chinese media against Chrystia Freeland. Mark Carney secures 85.8% of the vote in that opaque race. Yeah, I think it's fair. Was China influential? I don't know. He probably would have won anyway. He's doing pretty well, but I would think China is behind him. polls, yeah, Frank Graves. I mean, we're in a position now where some people are calling a Mark Carney majority. And, back when he had just taken the baton from Trudeau, who was at about 6%, it seemed like they had to get some wild polling going. And I don't think it would be beyond a Frank Graves to, start pushing it, pushing the boundaries. In my mind, polling can be used to start to get a narrative going. And then, yeah, I do think so. And then you get some clustering. And, I'm not saying that certainly there's been a great balancing, and Carney and Polyev probably pretty close. But I think there's a lot of noise and a lot of nonsense going on in polling. So you mentioned this individual, Alexander or Alex Nanoff or Danoff, connected to Guntan. Important for me to say, as you said, I mean, Handon is pursuing legal action against Global News and myself for the reporting. That's still proceeding. So as you say, he strongly denies, any involvement. As I report every time I talk about him, he strongly denies anything. But yes, there was a lot of activity around Guntan. This is according to CSIS documentation. And if you've got a pollster that you say worked in his office and then, has a bunch of new companies pop up, and then you're saying Yuen Pao Wu, look, Yuen Pao Wu, I'll say it again if I've not said it before. Yuen Pao Wu is clearly representing the interests of Beijing. There's no hiding that. I know it because I was told the US government was interested in his activities. This was one of my first meetings, off the record with a US official who gave me an awareness that the US government was watching Yuen Pao Wu, who, by the way, will also deny any wrongdoing. But I have a tape recording of him saying that he will support the United Front in Canada. And he got standing in the Hogue Commission to do that. I can't, Yuen Pao Wu, if you say you're not doing anything, against Canada's interests, I disagree. But look, what you've pointed to, this polling company popping up, yeah, that does look a little interesting. And I'll tell you, look, I've never got a call from a pollster in my life. Family members tell me they haven't, and our phones are just getting pounded in the last few weeks. So very clearly, there's a lot going on. And yeah, this is probably the most pivotal Canadian election any of us have ever lived through.
Yeah, and it's scaring a lot of Canadians, unfortunately. They're really worried about whether or not the polls are real or not. And our message to them is we've stopped looking at the polls for any sort of certainty. We've certainly stopped looking at 338 Canada, and that's no indictment on the folks running 338 Canada. We think they do good work. The issue is the data feeding 338 Canada is the problem. So when you have all of these other firms just blasting these, call it statistically impossible polls and results and weighting them, which is another problem, then you're going to completely skew the aggregate that 338 Canada actually shows everybody. But the problem is the mainstream media, they're always pointing to 338 Canada and saying, oh, well, look at the polling now. Well, sure, whatever you want to think. But I think what Canadians are now most worried about, and this is where we're trying to reassure them, they're worried that the Liberals are going to rig the election. And our perspective is this. Listen, in the Hogue Report, in terms of investigative journalists like yourself, has China tried to interfere in elections in the past? Sure. Have they interfered successfully in getting some of their pro-China candidates into positions where they are on the ballot? Evidence suggests that is true.
Yes.
Has there been evidence that they have significantly impacted the outcome of which party wins the election? The evidence seems to point to no. They've been able to, I would say, interfere within at least one candidate and potentially prevent him from winning, which is Kenny Chu. They have mass influence campaigns trying to influence who is voting for who, as do the Russians. But we haven't seen actual interference of rigging the election that we can find. Is that close to what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I've got broad thoughts on this. In my view, I've seen cases where I could say with confidence that a leader that probably could have won anyway certainly was chosen by China and supported, and extremely funny business went on. This includes Justin Trudeau. I've reported on for the Bureau a document that says Justin Trudeau is favored by Beijing, but they calibrated their sophisticated support in 2019 to show some displeasure over the detention of Man Wanzhou, and they had an incredibly the document suggests sophisticated Ministry of State security operation to get visual puppeting into ridings all across Canada, supporting members of all three different major parties, and yet at local levels supporting, picking support from people, let's just say NDP or Conservative, that they felt could, be beneficial to them for whatever reason. And yet still the support was weighted towards the Liberals and the leader that they wanted back in 2012, 2013, who is Justin Trudeau, right? Whether you want to call him a Manchurian candidate or not, quite possibly he didn't need China's support, but also quite evidently they want him there. And I would say the same for Carney. So here's the issue: if we are in a razor's edge election, a pivotal election, never more important for Canada in our lifetimes, or maybe ever, where Poilievre and Carney could be neck and neck, I do think China could throw the weight on that election. I have no question in my mind they could, and it's even possible, the evidence, or at least the intelligence is, in the past two elections, Beijing did apparently want minorities with liberals, in the leader's chair. Did they, achieve those results, or, did they sort of help it a little bit? It's hard to say, but I mean, I do have, and I think my sources or people that I could talk to in the past would say that it was getting to a point where we may not be having free and fair elections. That was up for debate. And this next one was what they were really afraid of. And I think, I haven't talked to people recently, but if they knew what was going on now, I'm sure their fears would be even worse.
So what can Canadians do about it? Because, I mean, I'm not one to just kind of sit here and be like, well, some foreign nation may or may not be trying to interfere in our elections. Let's just sit back and enjoy, you know what I mean? So what can we do?
That's a great question. And I mean, I wake up at night or in the morning thinking, I sometimes have to shake my head and say, are we in this position in Canada? I mean, the very first thing is make sure all your family members and friends vote in this election. And to the extent that you can, I mean, if you feel, let's just say, anyone that's listening, if you feel you're one of, the more read, more attuned, more higher information people in your circle, I think it's time to reach out to people and say, hey, you're hearing this and that. Maybe you're watching Power and Politics and it seems like Mr. Carney is the second coming of the Messiah for Canada. Maybe it's not so simple. Go read the Bureau or Northern Perspective and look at this guy's connections around the world. Look, listen to none other than Jim Balsillie from Research in Motion that just came out with a podcast saying Mr. Carney has been right there, the architect of failed economic policy. And he is just the same as Mr. Trudeau, but will accelerate us down a road of making us more poor by taxing what we're good at and subsidizing what we don't have. So look, what I felt, I want to say, when I listened to Mr. Balsillie, who's got the economic and trade piece down, and I put that together with the security piece, that I have down, they're both going in the same direction. That is, Canada's in trouble, and if we don't vote the right way, and I say it's a time for change of government, that's my own view, I think, really it could be, Puerto Rico without a passport. So that's what I would say. I mean, it's time to, I know you know, politics and religion, we're not supposed to talk about them too much, but I just think why, it's time to try to educate people, and they may not be happy about it. But to your question, what else can we do, right?
Well, and this is where, I don't agree with Donald Trump on a lot of things, but I agree with him on this point where he said, make it too big to rig. And that was his message before the last election. And in the last election, almost 40% of Canadians didn't vote. So that is a massive number. And so our message to Canadians is, if you don't think that your vote matters, remember, many of these ridings are decided by 100 votes or less.
Yep.
So, if you talk to a few people a day, and you manage to convince them A, to vote, and B, to vote the right way, that's the difference between somebody winning their riding or not. And if enough people do that, that's the difference between a change in government or not. So, even another 10% of Canadians, that is a massive amount. That's another probably 2.5 to 3 million registered voters out there that will make a huge difference in this. So, so this is where Canada needs to get to work. We need to have these conversations. To your point, Sam, get educated on what Mark Carney actually is, and make sure people know what is actually going on.
Yeah, and I would add to that, like, at the risk of being too opinionated, I do think, and whenever I, join a podcast, I tell people, there's a lot of smart geopolitical people in capitals around the world that are no longer hiding the fact that they think we're in 1938, 1939. The collision course, Russia, Ukraine, China, the United States, the powers circling around Taiwan, it could not be closer to the outbreak of World War III. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but in capitals right now, people are planning for that. And I do think, Donald Trump's rhetoric is just egregious, unforgivable. And yet, I do think at a deeper level, the American government at a state level, not just Donald Trump with his, wrecking ball rhetoric, they're trying to secure the Western Hemisphere. Listen to Marco Rubio. Read some Marco Rubio speeches if you want a little bit more of a view of what the American state is saying. This is like, to them, it's like almost like the missile crisis. Latin America, Caribbean, Canada, Mexico have a level of infiltration from China that the average person has no idea. I've done my part, even though some of my stories may sound alarming, even crazy, they turn out to be true, right? The level of infiltration surrounding America from China is off the charts. And what's going on in Taiwan, off the charts. How do I know? Because I talk to officials in Japan, Taiwan, Australia, United States. So I'm getting a little bit more of a view of what's being said in capitals that you're not getting on Power and Politics or like the Toronto Star, the average media in Canada right now. So if you can talk to family members and say, look, there's a lot going on, and it could not be more crucial for Canada to take the right directions now, with security, with strengthening our own economy, with getting stronger with our allies, even when they're talking mean to us. That's my own personal viewpoint.
Well, it's it's stranger than fiction, as they say. Virtually every one of your articles, it feels like almost like a Michael Crichton novel, or no, Tom Clancy novel. I always mix them up. Tom Clancy. But, this is the world that we're living in right now, and Canadians need to open their eyes and realize this is the world that we're living in. Because to your point, I'd say 80% of Canadians have no idea what is really going on in the geopolitical sphere of the world. But that's all we have time for today. I know you have to get running, but thank you so much for joining us, Sam. For those watching, head on over to the Bureau. Subscribe to Sam's content. It helps him continuing to do what he does, and the information that he is providing is absolutely invaluable to Canadians and podcasts like ours, Northern Perspective. So Sam, thank you very much for continuing to do what you do, and we'll see you again.
Thanks. Great talking with your team always.